forward. And our normal procedure, and I think we have several other members joining us. We'll ask unanimous consent to have them join us too, is we'll go through the members who sit on the committee and then defer to you, both in opening statements and in our questioning. So again, as members return, we will begin that process. Mr. Issa, the chair of the full committee, always likes us to remind people, have the chairs remind folks why we are here, why we do what we're doing as the Government Oversight and Reform Committee, and our mission statement, which is simple, that taxpayers sent us here to oversee taxpayer dollars, programs, how they're expended. Congress both authorizes and appropriates laws, but the oversight function is extremely important, and it keeps us focused on our responsibility, making certain that programs work, that taxpayer dollars are wisely spent, that Washington and the people who represent hardworking Americans who do have, again, accountability of their government. So that's an important responsibility. Today, the focus of today's hearing is really going to focus on where we are on some of our federal drug laws, policy, and enforcement. As most of you know, there's a growing disparity between what our laws say at the federal level, now with our laws at the local and state level, complete opposites in some cases, and various officials from the President of the United States to administration officials going in different direction on the question of legalization of marijuana. As most of you also know, 20 states, the District of Columbia, have taken steps to legalize marijuana for medical purposes. And in 2012, Colorado and Washington legalized marijuana at the state level for recreational use. The only problem with this is we do have conflicting federal statutes. I asked the staff to pull out federal statutes, and these are actually the federal statutes, Title 21, and that sets up a schedule, and it classifies substances and sets really the highest level of narcotics that are under federal jurisdiction and the responsibility of enforcement. So this is the federal law, and that's where we are at this point. What's taken place is, again, these states have taken actions and localities. Excuse me. This Washington crud is, let me have a little drink here, is something that comes with the cold weather. But again, we've heard what the law is. We've seen what states are doing, and unfortunately, there's chaos as it relates to where we're going and what our policy is as far as what's allowed, what's legalized, and now enforcement's going to react. To compound this, in our society, we all look to the President for leadership, regardless of what party he is, and the current President has made some statements of late. In fact, just a few days ago, President Obama said, I'll quote, "I don't think it's more dangerous than alcohol," referring to marijuana. And then he said, it's important for it to go forward because it's important for society not to have a situation in which a large portion of people have all at one time or another broken the law and only a few select people get punished. That was a statement by the President of the United States in regard to legalization. So again, you have a growing, I call it the schizophrenic approach to what's going on and where we are and where we may go. At the same time, the President of the United States, our Chief Executive, is making that statement. I've got an article from Washington Post, and the DEA operations chief of the Drug Enforcement Administration called the legalization of marijuana at the state level reckless and irresponsible, warning that the movement to decriminalize the sale of pot in the United States will have severe consequences. Then it's also interesting to see the path that the administration is also heading down. This is another article I just came across, and it said that the Department of Justice is now looking at releasing lower-level drug criminals who were sentenced under tough laws. In fact, this article, and I'll quote it, it says, "In an unprecedented move, the Deputy Attorney General James C. Cole asked defense lawyers on Thursday to help the government locate prisoners and encourage them to apply for clemency." Clemency drive as part of the Obama administration to deal with changes again in law. And again, we have an approach that is very fractured between federal, state, and local agencies and officials, as you can hear from what I just said. The witness that we have before us is actually under the Office of National Drug Control Policy. It was set there some years ago as part of the White House to help coordinate, again, national policy on drug use and abuse. And in spite of the federal prohibitions on marijuana, the Department of Justice has issued a policy memorandum that explicitly declines to enforce federal marijuana laws in states that have legalized it for recreational use. In fact, illegal marijuana dispensaries in Colorado and Washington are facing the realities of operating outside the federal law, and the Department of Justice recently announced they'll be issuing guidance that will allow federally regulated banks to serve these illegal businesses. The Department of Justice, and let me say, too, today we're only going to hear from ONDCP, but I do plan to try to have a continuum of dialogue on where we're going with this. And we invited the Department of Justice. They declined, wanted a little bit more time. We'll give them the time and then have them in. I'd like to also have DEA and other agencies, and then hear from some of those that have worked in the field of trying to help both the country and our citizens and youth deal with the illegal narcotics question. So we get representatives of some various groups. And I might recall, for the benefit of my colleagues, I chaired the Criminal Justice Drug Policy Subcommittee from, I think it was 98 to 2001, and held the very first hearings ever held in Congress on the subject of marijuana. And saying that, we'd also invite, I think it's Normal and some of the other folks to participate in the discussions about where we're going. So the other thing that we have to consider today is that about $25 billion was provided for drug control programs. That's $25 billion in fiscal 2012 enforcement and a whole host of other activities. $10.1 billion, or about 40%, was provided for prevention and treatment programs. So we have a big financial stake in some of these programs and where we're going. In fact, 15 federal agencies administer 76 programs aimed at drug abuse and prevention. Despite the illicit drug use, despite all that, illicit drug use is, in fact, increasing with our adolescents, and marijuana currently accounts for 80% of illicit drug use by our adolescents. I think these are probably the most recent statistics. Usually some of these fall more than a year behind. We're but the 2011, the latest statistics we have, show that adolescent use of marijuana was the highest it's been in 8 years. And first-time users of marijuana have unfortunately increased under this administration, hitting also in 2011, my most recent data, a 10-year high. Well, maybe that's not a good term to use on this, but adolescent use of marijuana is associated with increased drug dependence, criminal activity, and even, again, the more potent marijuana that we have on the market today with affecting the IQ and also possibly the genetic makeup of folks. ONDCP, and we'll have a representative to speak for themselves today, and that department today has consistently worked to reduce the prevalence of marijuana use and focus on evidence-based prevention messaging. In 2013, the National Drug Control Strategy, the President's message to Congress, and he gives us a message with that title every year, said, and let me quote from it, "The importance of prevention is becoming ever more apparent. Despite positive trends in other areas, we continue to see elevated rates of marijuana use among young people, likely driven by declines in perception of risk." That's what the document, the official document that was sent to us said. So given the recent statements to the media in the past couple of weeks claiming that marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol, it appears that, unfortunately, the President may, in fact, be a major contributor now to some of the declines we see in the perception of risk and what we're going to see in the future. So, again, our hearing today will focus on our major agency dealing with this, the Office of National Drug Control Policy. We'll hear statements and hopefully some idea of where we're going. I have a number of questions, and we've had a lot of interest from members on both sides of the aisle to find out what direction the administration and our federal laws are heading in the future on the question of marijuana use and legalization. With that, I'm pleased to welcome, with perfect timing, we do have the full committee ranking member, but our ranking member of the subcommittee is Mr. Conley, the gentleman from Virginia. You're recognized in whatever order you wish to proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. But as certainly a courtesy, I would defer to Mr. Cummings, the ranking member of the full committee, if he has a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Conley, and to you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you both for holding this hearing. And you're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. This is a very complex and difficult issue. I want to also thank Deputy Director Botticelli for testifying before the subcommittee. This is also a quickly changing issue, and the positions of conservatives and progressives alike are evolving as we learn from experiences of states with legalization initiatives. According to a Gallup poll taken in October, 58% of the American people favor the legalization of marijuana. Over the past 8 years, 20 states and the District of Columbia have passed laws permitting the use of marijuana for medical conditions. And in 2012, Colorado and Washington chose to legalize, tax, and regulate limited amounts of marijuana for recreational use. I believe the purpose of today's hearing is worthwhile: to review the position of federal agencies with respect to states that are legalizing marijuana, both for medicinal purposes and recreational uses. The Office of National Drug Control Policy serves as a very critical role in balancing our nation's drug control efforts by coordinating government-wide public health and safety initiatives that address drug use and its consequences in our communities. In addition, the Department of Justice is charged with enforcing the Federal Controlled Substances Act, and it issued guidance to prosecutors in August on marijuana enforcement. Mr. Chairman, I'm thankful that ONDCP is here today, but as you know, I believe this hearing would have been more informative with the Justice Department at the table. I know our officers work together to try to find a mutually acceptable date, and your decision to move forward today with ONDCP alone is not your prerogative. I hope we can continue to work together in a bipartisan way as we have in the past to get the viewpoints of the other agencies involved. Personally, I share your concerns about the negative health effects of marijuana, particularly on the youth in my district and across the country. Even when it is used for medicinal purposes, people should understand very clearly that smoking marijuana is dangerous to their lungs and their hearts, and it results in a wide range of negative health effects. Apart from health concerns, however, I also have serious questions about the disparate impact of the federal government's enforcement policies on minorities. After reviewing the FBI uniform crime reports and state databases, on one article found, and I quote, "Police arrest blacks for marijuana possession at a higher rate than whites in every state and nearly every city and county, despite the two races using marijuana at equal rates." My home state of Maryland has similar disparities in enforcement. In October, the American Civil Liberties Union issued a report finding that, and I quote, "Police arrest blacks for marijuana possession at higher rates than whites in every county in Maryland," end of quote, accounting for 58% of arrests for marijuana possession. These disparities have a real impact on people's lives, their families, and their communities. An arrest for even the smallest amount of marijuana can disqualify a person for public housing, student financial aid, or even employment for life. These are the exact opportunities that so many low-income individuals need to lift themselves out of poverty. I think the President was exactly right when he said last week, middle-class kids don't get locked up for smoking pot. Poor kids do. And African-American kids and Latino kids are more likely to be poor and less likely to have the resources and the support to avoid unduly harsh penalties, and I would add to that records, criminal records, that remain with them for a lifetime. For these reasons, Maryland has chosen to decrease penalties to 90 days for possession of marijuana in small amounts. It also required courts to consider a defendant's use of medical marijuana as an affirmative defense, and it permitted research on medical marijuana. Mr. Chairman, I previously served as the ranking member of the subcommittee on criminal justice and drug policy, so I understand that there are various components to this debate. But one thing does concern me greatly, how in some states one can purchase marijuana, and the people in my state and in my district are getting arrested and serving sentences. And it just seems to me there's something not right about that. And I'm hoping that you will address that, Mr. Botticelli, because these are serious consequences. It's one thing when you have equal enforcement, but it's another thing when some people are engaged in purchasing marijuana in the streets and other ones in the suites. And so what happens is that you have unequal enforcement, and you have many African-American young men, as you well know, spending long sentences sitting in prison, while others, law enforcement don't even touch. So those are the kinds of concerns that I have, Mr. Chairman, and I'm hoping that we will get to some of that today. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, but let's see, Mr. Turner, you had no opening statement. We'll go back to Mr. Conley. And before I do, Mr. Conley, ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, be allowed to participate on this panel. Without objection, so ordered. And we're also joined by Mr. Davis, who will be recognized after Mr. Conley because he is on the committee but not the subcommittee. Then we'll go in alphabetical order, and we'll hear from Mr. Blumenauer and Mr. Cohen next. Mr. Conley, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing to examine the federal response to state marijuana laws. I want to be clear from the outset, I'm not unsympathetic to the concerns raised by skeptics on decriminalization. As a child of the 60s, I witnessed firsthand the ravages of drug abuse among so many friends and so many idols my generation had in both Hollywood and in the music scene. I count myself, frankly, a skeptic. Further, as a former senior professional staff member in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of my jobs was the authorization of the International Narcotics Matter Bureau of the State Department, and I traveled the world looking at production and distribution of illicit drugs and saw the damage caused. But it must also be noted that simply ramping up criminal penalties, such as enacting mandatory minimum sentences through the Boggs Act and the Narcotics Control Act of the 1950s, did not prove effective in countering the very movement and the very ravages I just talked about in the 1960s. In addition, as a member of Congress, it's been disappointing to visit countries such as Afghanistan, only to find that many of the current international narcotics control challenges are the very same ones I looked at in 1980s. Further, despite my wariness of outright marijuana legalization, I am alarmed by the figures contained in a recent FBI report that found in 2011, 750,000 Americans were arrested for marijuana law violation, which amounts to 1 American every 42 seconds. And that rate outpaced the total number of arrests made for violent crimes that same year. In 2010 alone, even in the face of budget shortfalls, states spent an estimated $3.6 billion enforcing marijuana possession laws, a total that represents a 30% increase compared to the amount spent a decade earlier, and this in a time of extreme budget constraints at the state and local level. In an era of constrained budgets, this drastic increase in enforcement costs raises the important question over how effective we are prioritizing limited law enforcement resources. It's troubling that despite 4 decades of federal efforts to enforce the criminalization of the manufacture, distribution, dispensation, and possession of marijuana, the United Nations World Drug Report found that while global cannabis consumption stays fairly stable, marijuana use is actually increasing here in the United States. The federal government's ineffectiveness in significantly reducing marijuana becomes even starker when one contrasts our nation's failure to stem rising marijuana usage rates with the results of our country's anti-tobacco campaign, which has actually been pretty successful. Without resorting to a policy of prohibition or criminalization, our country has brought tremendous resources to bear in an effort to prevent and reduce tobacco use, especially among young people. And those efforts are working. Our nation cut adult smoking in half, from 42.4% in 1965 to 18% in 2012. Employing data-driven tactics, states and municipalities have continued to refine anti-tobacco initiatives, enacting policies focused on creating smoke-free environments and increasing the price of cigarettes. Just today, there was a new campaign announced by the United States government aimed specifically at teenage smoking to deter it. These types of policies have led to impressive results. For example, California successfully lowered its adult smoking rate from 16.3% in 2000 to 12.7% 12 years later. And with respect to reducing frequent cigarette use among youth nationwide, the CDC reports the decrease has been dramatic, falling from 16.8% in 1999 to just 7.3% in 2009. Our steady progress in reducing tobacco use serves as a valuable reminder that the best policies to prevent and reduce the use of harmful substances need not always be, and perhaps shouldn't be, total prohibition and criminalization. Beyond questions of effectiveness, Congress must also not forget the issue of equity, which the distinguished ranking member eloquently pointed us to. Research has found that in 2010, Black Americans were nearly 4 times as likely as white Americans to be arrested on charges of marijuana possession, even though both groups use marijuana in roughly equal percentages. Worse, the data indicates that these racial disparities are even greater when you dig down to the state level. Black Americans being 8 times as likely as whites to be arrested in certain states, Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota, for example. I cannot help but view all of this data through the prism of my time in local government, where we prioritized results over ideology, and we allowed evidence to guide policy, particularly when addressing matters of public health and safety. I've long believed that the federal government governs best when it truly listens and learns from the states, which for decades have served as the laboratories of our democracy. The citizens of states across the country seem to have spoken loud and clear. They want their local governments to have the opportunity to innovate and even experiment with regulatory and enforcement frameworks governing marijuana use specifically. I believe it's in our national interest to let those ongoing laboratories of democracy proceed, and while we learn from them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank the gentleman. We'll hear now from a gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank you for holding this hearing. And I think many of us approach it with mixed feelings and mixed emotions. Over the weekend, I've been involved in several conversations simply with friends and relatives, and I don't think in any of those did we reach any conclusions. We all had different feelings, different thoughts, different ideas. I'd like to be associated with the comments relative to the disparities in arrest that the ranking member made, as well as Mr. Connolly. And quite frankly, I think that my state, the state of Illinois, has a shameful record. There are a lot of things that I'm proud of my state about, but when it comes to this kind of disparity, it's hard to imagine that it actually does exist and that it is continuing. Mr. Botticelli, I'd like to ask some questions relative to the role of OCDP as we explore this issue and as we talk about it and as we try and clarify what the role of your office might be relative to the prospective legalization of marijuana. According to the National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act of 1993, your office is not permitted to use any federal funds to conduct any study or contract relating to the legalization for a medical use or any other use of a substance listed in Schedule 1 of Section 202 of the Controlled Substance Act, which includes marijuana. How does this congressional mandate restrict your ability to examine the spread and legalization of medicinal marijuana and its alleged benefits? Yes. Sorry. Oh, we're doing. Oh, well, I'm delighted to continue in a.
Hold that. It's a little hard to hear you, Mr. Davis. Just up a little bit closer.
Yeah, that's generally very unusual. I'm usually easy to hear. In a recent Gallup poll, for the first time, a majority of Americans were in favor of legalized marijuana. In addition, there is a clearly growing tide of states that have moved to legalize medicinal marijuana, and I, for one, have held the position for quite a while that it could and should be used for medicinal purposes. However, I'm not sure about the whole question of promoting in any way, shape, form, or fashion the usage for other reasons, because I'm afraid that, as I've seen with alcohol in the community where I live, there are stores where individuals are lined up before 9 o'clock waiting for them to open. And I'm fearful that we might see the same thing with the dispensation of marijuana. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, and we'll now hear from Mr. Blumenauer, the gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee's courtesy in permitting me to join with you in this, and I think it is a timely and important hearing. I agree with the Chair that the federal government is not necessarily coordinated on this. I agree that the committee has a responsibility to deal with the use of federal dollars, and I think you referenced $25 billion spent on drug enforcement overall. And I certainly agree wholeheartedly with the dangers of adolescent use of marijuana. I think the question before us that we might be able to explore today, and I hope we're able, under your leadership, to move further, is just how best are we going to address those issues. We have been engaged in an experiment of over 40 years of prohibition of marijuana, which has failed spectacularly. 50 million people use it annually. About half the American adult population has used it. As a couple of my colleagues have referenced, a majority of Americans now think it should be legal. And if you ask that question differently, if you say, should the federal government respect the decisions of the states, like we do with alcohol, that percentage goes up even higher. Mr. Chairman, I noted last week in your state, almost 700,000 signatures were delivered that will require a vote in the fall on Florida becoming the first southern state to approve medical marijuana. And recent surveys indicate about 2/3 of the population now says they support it, and I've seen one survey that's much higher than that. We've talked about the costs. I think if we shift from a prohibition, enforcement, incarcerate, and instead deal to tax and regulate, it's going to mean probably conservatively $100 billion of public dollars available over the next 10 years. It is outrageous that 8 million people have been arrested in the last decade, and as several of my colleagues have mentioned, it is outrageous that African American youth, primarily young men, are almost 4 times as likely to be arrested as white youth, even though, in fact, there's evidence that the white youth use marijuana as much or more than African American. And I think it was Mr. Cummings who referenced some of the disparities in different regions. There's some areas in Louisiana where that disparity is 11 times greater for African American youth. And I do think the administration needs to think through what a comprehensive approach should be. The President has acknowledged what most Americans know. Marijuana is, well, frankly, not as dangerous to your health as tobacco. It's not as addictive. Congress is also out of touch, I would suggest, because Congress established these schedules that you referenced in your opening statement. According to what we have in statute, marijuana is Schedule I, which puts it on a par with LSD and heroin, has no medicinal properties, and is more dangerous than coke and methamphetamines. And I don't think you will find any sheriff, any district attorney, or any health expert who would remotely suggest that that is true. We are in a situation now where there is nobody who checks the identification of an adolescent. They're not asked to prove their age. There's no license that a drug dealer loses. Mr. Connolly's comments about the progress that we've made with tobacco, which is highly addictive and still kills hundreds of thousands of people a year, is significant. And I am hopeful that with this committee's leadership, we can look at how maybe we rationalize this, that we don't interfere with the states, where 146 million people live where it's perfectly legal to buy marijuana under state laws, most of it according to votes of the people. And there are little things that we can do to fix anomalies. Federal law forces legitimate marijuana businesses to be entirely cash. They can't get a bank account, and delivering their tax payments with shopping bags full of cash. If you care about money laundering, if you care about tax evasion and theft, is crazy. It's just crazy. And we tax these legally authorized under state and local law businesses 2 and 3 times more heavily than we treat other businesses. I know Mr. Norquist, Grover Norquist, joined me in a press conference on legislation I have to fix that. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your dealing with this issue. I appreciate your courtesy in allowing me to be with you, and I hope you can help shine a light and we can have this important conversation.
Well, thank you for joining us. Just one thing I'll point out. When I showed the schedule today, and I had heard the President say that Congress had to resolve this matter, the staff in their briefings to me said that actually they have the authority to change that without Congress.
Absolutely.
So that's something I want to get into with Mr. Botticelli and where they intend to go on this. But some good points. And let me yield now to gentleman also not part of the panel, but came to the hearing. Thank you, Mr. Cohen from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Micah. First, I want to thank you for allowing me to participate. I enjoyed serving under you on Transportation Committee. And secondly, I'd like to incorporate by reference all of the things that have been said that are politically correct on this issue as if I said them. And basically, I agree with most of them. And I want to thank the President. I don't think the President has been schizophrenic. The President hasn't gone nearly as far as I would like to see him go on this issue because it's a freedom issue. But the President has gone somewhat in enlightening the public as to priorities and as to Louis Brandeis and the laboratories of democracy, and we're on the right path. I would submit, with all due respect to my fellows on the other side, that schizophrenia, which my father was a psychiatrist and taught me something about, could be described as a party that talks about saving money all the time and being concerned with deficits and being totally driven by that, but not being concerned in saving money when people are in jail for marijuana and mandatory minimums that judges have said were awful, and for nonviolent first-time offenders who are serving lifetime sentences in jail, costing us $30,000 a year, and the population of jails has gone up 800% in the last 30 years. That's schizophrenia. You're concerned about cost and cutting costs, but not when it's jailing a population. I think it's schizophrenia when you're all for state issues and preemption and priorities and giving power back to the states, but not when it comes to them passing laws concerning marijuana. Then you're not for state initiatives and state priorities. And I think there's a certain schizophrenia for a party that talks about civil liberties, but not when it comes to personal liberties on this subject. So sometimes politics makes strange bedfellows, and whether they're in the same bin as McMurphy or not is another issue to be discussed. Mr. Botticelli, your hands are tied on Schedule 1, but it is ludicrous, absurd, crazy to have marijuana in the same level as heroin. Ask the late Philip Seymour Hoffman, if you could. Nobody dies from marijuana. People die from heroin. And every second that we spend in this country trying to enforce marijuana laws is a second that we're not enforcing heroin laws. And heroin and meth are the two drugs that are ravaging our country. And every death, including Mr. Hoffman's, is partly the responsibility of the federal government's drug priorities for not putting total emphasis on the drugs that kill, that cause people to be addicted and have to steal to support their habit. And heroin and meth is where all of your priorities should be. And it's not just Mr. Hoffman, a brilliant actor at 46 years of age, who first went to prescription drugs and then came back to heroin. That's our two major issues, I guess. I had a young friend, son of a girl I dated, who died of a heroin overdose about 2 years ago. I went to a party in Memphis recently, not Vermont, where the governor spent his entire State of the State hour address talking about the ravages of heroin in his state, but Memphis, Tennessee, where 4 women, give or take my age, well, maybe 15 years younger, sometimes I lose perspective, talked about heroin being a great problem among their children and in the Memphis community, and about another young man who had died of heroin. Heroin is getting into the arms of young people. And when we put marijuana on the same level as heroin and LSD and meth and crack and cocaine, we are telling young people not to listen to the adults about the ravages and the problems, and they don't listen because they know you're wrong. Because as Mr. Micah said, we know a lot of young people smoke marijuana. They shouldn't. Young people should be being young people. The most precious commodity in the world is time. Young people have got lots of time. Mr. Mike and I don't have that much more time. That's just the realities. And when you're young, enjoy being young, playing ball, taking it easy, just doing kids' things and learning. And you shouldn't be doing drugs, but they are. And we need to be sure that we keep them alive. We need to educate them. But our efforts ought to be toward meth and heroin. That's where efforts should be. And it shouldn't be Schedule 1. Anybody that goes to jail for marijuana is a crime. When people for possession are taking their liberties away, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of resources, it's a crime committed by our government. There is a cultural lag in this country, and this Congress is a leader in it. My time has expired. I thank the committee for allowing me to express myself. I will participate in questioning and yield back the non-existent remainder of my time.
Yeah, I thank the gentleman, and thank each of the members for their opening statements. We'll now turn to our witness at this hearing, and the witness is Mr. Michael Botticelli. He is the Deputy Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Mr. Botticelli, it is the custom and practice of our committee and subcommittee as an investigative oversight panel in Congress to swear in our witnesses. So if you'll stand, please, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee of Congress is the whole truth and nothing but the truth? The witness answered in the affirmative, and we'll let the record reflect that. Mr. Botticelli, you're the only witness today, so we won't hold you too much to the 5, but we'll try to keep you within that. If you have additional information you'd like to have submitted to the committee, the subcommittee, we would welcome that through request of the chair. And again, we thank you for your participation, and we'll recognize you now for your opening statement.
Great. Chairman Micah, Ranking Member Conley, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to address the public health and safety issues surrounding marijuana in the United States. My name is Michael Botticelli. I'm the Deputy Director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Before I was sworn into this position in November 2012, I was the Director of the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services in the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. I have over 20 years' experience working in public health. I also served a variety of leadership positions and roles for the National Association of State Alcohol and Drug Abuse Directors. In addition, I am proud to say that I am one of 23 million Americans who is also in long-term recovery from addictive disorders. The Office of National Drug Control Policy was established by Congress in 1988 with the principal purpose of reducing illicit drug use, manufacturing and trafficking, drug-related crime and violence, and drug-related health consequences. We produced the National Drug Control Strategy, which is the administration's primary blueprint for drug policy. This strategy is a 21st century plan that is based on science and research. I'm here today to testify specifically about marijuana, the considerable public health consequences associated with the drug, and ONDCP's ongoing efforts to reduce and prevent its use and related consequences throughout the nation. In 2012 alone, nearly 32 million Americans aged 12 and older reported using the drug within the past year, making it the most commonly used illicit drug in the United States. Unfortunately, although overall marijuana use rates in the United States are well below what they were in the late 1970s, they have increased in recent years. Since 2007, current marijuana use among Americans 12 or older has increased from 5.8% to 7.3% in 2012, a difference of over 4 million people. While national surveys indicate that marijuana use rates among young people aged 12 to 17 have decreased from 8% in 2002 to 7% in 2012, this trend masked recent increases in use among young people, particularly between 2008 and 2011. Science tells us that youth perception of marijuana, as youth perceptions of marijuana decline, their use of marijuana goes up. And data from the 2013 Monitoring the Future survey reveal that the perceived harm of using marijuana regularly among 8th and 10th graders is at its lowest point since the survey began collecting this information in 1991. And among high school seniors, it's at the lowest since 1978. We also know that marijuana has considerable health and safety implications for users themselves, their families, and our communities. In 2012, approximately 4.3 million Americans met the diagnostic criteria for abuse or dependence on marijuana, more than any other drug. Marijuana use can have implications for learning and memory, and long-term use of marijuana begun during adolescence is associated with an average 8-point lower IQ later in life. And we are concerned about major increases in marijuana's potency, which has tripled over the past 30 years. The consequences of marijuana use are particularly acute in our healthcare and substance use disorder treatment system. In 2011, marijuana was involved in nearly 456,000 emergency department visits nationwide, and in 2012, approximately 314,000 Americans reported receiving treatment for marijuana use in the past year, more than any other illicit drug, and trailing only alcohol and pain relievers. These figures represent a sobering picture of this drug's very real and serious consequences. This administration has been consistent in its opposition to attempt to legalize marijuana and other drugs. This opposition is driven by what medical science and research tells us about the drugs. We know that calls for legalization often paint an inaccurate and incomplete picture of marijuana's significant health consequences. And while voters in Colorado and Washington voted to legalize the sale and distribution of marijuana in their states, the vote does not change the negative public health consequences of marijuana. Even advocates of the law in these states acknowledge the negative public health effects and maintain that underage use should not be permitted. As you indicated, Chairman, in establishing the Controlled Substances Act, Congress determined that marijuana is a harmful drug and made the illegal distribution and sale of marijuana a serious crime. Recent state laws have not changed the federal status of marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance, and the Department of Justice's responsibility to enforce the CSA remains unchanged. As the Department of Justice has noted, federal drug enforcement resources prioritize and target serious crimes of dealing, violent crime, and trafficking. The Department of Justice has not historically devoted resources to prosecuting individuals whose conduct is limited to possession of small amounts of marijuana for personal use on private property. Recent Department of Justice guidance is consistent with this position and focuses on protecting public health and safety in states and communities, a goal shared by the entire administration. Office of National Drug Control Policy Strategy has supported a wide variety of programs to prevent illicit drug use from occurring, to treat those with substance use disorders in order to avoid involvement with the criminal justice system, and not to encourage criminal justice system, and encourages criminal justice system reforms to more humanely and more effectively treat those with substance use disorders through health interventions. To this end, we have supported a variety of community prevention efforts. One such powerful tool is the Drug-Free Communities Support Program, a program funded by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. DFC coalitions across the country have identified marijuana as a significant problem in their communities. Recent evaluation data indicate that where DFC dollars are invested and coalitions operate, youth substance use is lower. We are working with our congressional partners on reauthorization of this vital program. Our Above the Influence media campaign, which is being transitioned to the partnership at drugfree.org, is another important national tool for informing and inspiring young people to reject illicit drugs, including marijuana. We also know that there is a significant treatment gap in the United States. Only 1 in 10 people who meet diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder get care for their disorder. And often that is because of lack of insurance status. We recognize that we need to provide treatment for those who are dealing with the consequences of drug use. The Affordable Care Act will expand coverage for substance use disorder treatment. An estimated 27 million people, previously uninsured Americans, will have coverage that includes a substance use disorder benefit. In addition, ONDCP has identified reducing drug driving as a national priority. Data from the Department of Transportation show that in 2009, cannabinoid use was reported among 25% of fatally injured drivers who were tested for the presence of drugs. In conclusion, ONDCP continues to work with our partners to reduce the public health effects of substance use, including marijuana. We know that there are ways to prevent and reduce substance use in America, and we look forward to working with Congress on this objective. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll turn to questions. And I'm going to yield first to Mr. Turner, who has another obligation.
Mr. Chairman, I greatly appreciate that. I do have another obligation. It gives me an opportunity to ask our question. Mr. Botticelli, in your statement, I was very taken by the sentence that says, the administration continues to oppose attempts to legalize marijuana and other drugs. So the natural question to you is, has the Office of the National Drug Control Policy been asked to weigh in on marijuana legalization battles that are going on in the states? If yes, what advice have you given during those battles, and do you plan to proactively weigh in on future legislative initiatives? If you continue to oppose it, what have you done?
Our role in terms of legalization efforts has been to provide constituents at both the national, state level and community level with accurate information as it relates particularly to the health consequences.
How do you do that? I mean, what constituents? I mean, do you post it on your website? Do you actively get in touch with the decision makers? Do you engage in the dialogue that's occurring during these debates?
We do it through our website by putting information on our website.
That's what I thought. Going to my next question. Despite the implementation of legal dispensaries, despite the implementation of what allegedly are legal dispensaries, the DEA has found illegal operations and has raided several marijuana dispensaries in Colorado. How confident are you that 100% of the drug trade in Colorado is free from the influence of drug cartels?
Sir, unfortunately, I'm the only representative at this hearing today, and I would ask that you defer those questions to either Department of Justice or DEA.
Well, we'll do that. The only reason why I ask you this question is because when you stated in your written testimony what your role was, you said it was, let's see, we were established by Congress for the principal purpose of reducing, and I see the line here, drug-related crime and violence and drug-related health consequences, trafficking. And so I thought you would have a statement with respect to drug cartels. Third question, what are you doing to ensure that marijuana will not be exported from legal states to illegal states? Again, seeing that from your written statement, that is certainly part of what you were tasked with by Congress. What do you see there, sir?
So as you're aware, in the August Department of Justice memo, they set out 8 criteria for any state that's moving toward legalization in terms of states' responsibility in implementing legalization efforts in terms of marijuana. Clearly, one of those criteria that the Department of Justice is looking at is preventing the state's responsibility in preventing the transportation of marijuana in states where it's legal to where it's not. It's incumbent upon the states to ensure that that does not happen. Our role in terms of Office of National Drug Control Policy is to really monitor not only the public safety, that criteria that they've laid out, but other public health and public safety criteria to determine what is the impact of legalization in those states as it affects those criteria.
Do you have concerns as to what you're seeing from that monitoring?
At this point, we are still gathering data, and I think it is premature to speculate in terms of those criteria and what the impact is seeing.
Well, again, looking back to what you described as your own congressional charter, obviously there is an expectation on the behalf of Congress that there would be, an active role that you play. We'll look forward to your conclusions. Mr. Chairman, thank you.